Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger, and this is the lecture for Chapter 2, Drugs and Their Effects, in the SAC book, Substance Abuse Counseling by Lewis, Dana, and Blevins for CDP 401, Treatment of Addiction. This is largely a review chapter from 400, if you've taken 400. However, what we're going to focus a little bit more on are the behind-the-scenes things, the behind-the-scenes attributions that can affect drugs rather than the pharmacological properties and drug classifications themselves. Okay. So by reading this chapter, the objectives are to identify the four groups of variables that affect a drug's effect of behavior. So, affect versus effect. Learn the difference. Describe 3 ways that 2 samples of street drugs may vary from one another. Define 3 ways of comparing 2 samples of street drugs. Give an example of how different routes of administration affect a drug effects. Demonstrate an example of how combining 2 or more drugs may alter effects of the drugs. Compare drug pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic processes. Summarize how psychological characteristics of the drug user affect a drug's actions. And give an example of how the environment can affect the drug user's behavior. Identify 3 categories used to describe drug effects. So why this is important, as you can see, that drug use is very complex and everybody's different. So we can't say that everyone that drinks alcohol is the same or that alcohol has the same effects on everybody, because that's simply not true. So you'll be really able to see, and when we work with clients, get an in-depth understanding about what is going on when they are using, and take all these variables into consideration. If I have a 15-year-old girl who is of African American descent and she's drinking alcohol, that's going to be different than if I have a 45-year-old Native American male who is drinking alcohol. Okay. So we have different classes of drugs that are grouped on the pharmacological properties. And it's important to know those classifications, and we go over that a lot in 400. Okay. All right. So let's just go over the definitions. A drug is any substance that alters the structure or function of some aspect of the user. Okay. We often see food and drugs classified together, FDA, Food Drug Administration, and later on in the chapter we talk a little bit about the interactions between drugs and food. Okay. All right. Things are not necessarily inherently bad in and of themselves. Okay. Vitamins and minerals that we take for health could have toxic reactions if taken in different quantities, if mixed with other things as well. So it's really important to look at the interactions between substances that we are imbibing. So even abusable drugs are not good or bad themselves, but the benefits and risks of substance use depend on how much, how often, and in what manner, and with what other drugs a particular substance is used. And this comes into play when we are taking comprehensive drug histories from our clients, which is why it's important to be as specific as possible. The connection between a drug's dose and its effect is called a dose-response relationship. Below a certain dosage is the threshold where there's no noticeable effect. As the dosage increases, the effect becomes increasingly strong until it reaches some maximum value. And the maximum effect attainable is determined by the user's physiology. And we see later on that tolerance affects this as well. If a person's used to drinking a lot and very often, 1 or 2 drinks will probably not yield any effect on them unless they're mixing it with something else, whereas a person that has never drank before, a glass of wine may make them feel tipsy. Okay. All right. There are different categories of drug effects. The desired effect, or the reason it's used, is the therapeutic effect. So for example, if I am depressed and I take an antidepressant, I'm hoping that that works and I no longer feel depressed. All other effects of the drug are collectively referred to as adverse drug reactions. Reliable, anticipated, and frequently encountered adverse drug reactions are generally referred to as side effects. Right. Now, some of us have allergic reactions, and those differ from side effects in the frequency of occurrence and the ability to anticipate their occurrence. Okay, so usually an allergic reaction is something that is a quick onset, whereas a side effect is something that is anticipated. We know that it's more or less common for clinical trials. Idiosyncratic reactions are highly unusual, that are unanticipated and unreliable. And toxic effects result from ingesting lethal or near lethal doses of the drug, which is often called an overdose. A person can overdose and not die. So lethal or near lethal doses of the drug. So be careful to not automatically assume that a person has overdosed and passed away. A person can be near death and have an overdose. Okay, all right. Potency is the amount of drug necessary to produce a certain effect. The more potent a drug is, the smaller dosage required to produce the desired effect. In general, substances that are in their natural state or less synthesized are not as potent as substances that have had technology applied to them. For example, the difference between smoking a marijuana flower, a bud, and doing a dab. The potency is very different. It's also the difference between somebody in South America that's eating the coca leaves, of which cocaine is made, versus somebody that is snorting processed cocaine. Potency is very different. Another example would be a beer, and not the fancy microbrews that are so popular up here in the Northwest and everywhere else nowadays. Let's talk about a PBR, right? 5.5% AV, alcohol volume, versus a shot of tequila, a 1.5 milliliter shot of tequila. Okay, all right. Now, the potency of a drug is determined by two factors, affinity and efficacy. Affinity refers to the drug's ability to attach itself to or bind with the receptor or site of action. Efficacy refers to the stimulatory power of the drug on the receptor. Drugs with high efficacy strongly stimulate receptors. Okay. The therapeutic ratio refers to the relationship between the lethal dose and the effective dose of a drug. The effective dose refers to the dose required to produce a particular effect in a certain proportion of the population. And the lethal dose refers to the dose required to kill a particular proportion of the recipients. Okay. So not everybody is made the same. Okay. So if you think of substances that are used for different purposes, a rhinoceros, which weighs a lot, is going to need a lot more tranquilizer than a human being. Okay. Very simple. Okay. Now, when we're looking at the differences between pharmaceutical and street drugs, one of the things that we have to look at is composition and quality. So pharmaceuticals are highly regulated. In general, we know how much of the active ingredient is in the substance, whereas street drugs we don't know because it's not regulated, and anybody at any point in that trade can take it and cut it with something or add things, dilute it, etc. Okay. So quality simply means that the actual composition of a drug may be different from what it is alleged to be. Quantity and purity refer to the fact that street drugs often vary in the proportions of active ingredients and adulterants. For example, cocaine on the street could be 10% to 90% cocaine. They estimate that it's about 50%. And then we have fillers, which could be anything that is white, flaky, or sparkly. So baking soda, sugar, boric acid. Okay. Now that is one of the main issues with street drugs. And every so often you'll hear about a quote-unquote bad batch of heroin that's laced with fentanyl. There's more of a concentrated quantity of something in it, and then people overdose because they don't know. A good example of that would be the difference between Molly, MDMA, and ecstasy. Ecstasy has MDMA in it. Molly would be considered the pure, just MDMA. One of the issues with ecstasy is that it can be cut with anything, and every once in a while there might be a batch that it's cut with heroin. So if a pill, an ecstasy tablet, has 3% heroin in it and the person's not used to taking heroin, then they're at risk for an overdose when they just think that there is ecstasy in it. But there are harm reduction techniques and kits that people can buy to test their drugs. Okay. Drug equivalents refers to the ways in which two or more drugs can be compared with one another. So we're looking at chemical equivalents, biological equivalents, and clinical equivalents. Okay. This means are the compounds identical? So for example, MDMA and methamphetamine are only 4 chemical reactions away from each other. Right. Bioavailability is when the measure of equivalence is biological equivalence. So drug compounds that are biologically equivalent provide the same amount of the active ingredient to the user. And then clinical equivalence, which is the observable effects of compounds. Okay. Frequency of use is very important. And when we're doing drug histories, it's something that we need to be very, very clear on how much and how often. If a person's using something very often, it increases the physiological and psychological changes. Okay. And one episode can be different from the next. Also, some substances, just like vitamins and minerals, are fat soluble versus water soluble, meaning that it can be stored in the tissues versus once the tissues are full, then it expels it. So for example, vitamin C, your body can only have a certain amount of vitamin C, and then after that, everything is excreted in the urine, versus THC, which accumulates within the body. Okay. Right. One of the most important things about drug use are the routes of administration. That is how somebody takes a substance into their body. And there's several different routes of administration that are very common, and then others that if used medically, they're used for specific purposes. When used in a drug context, can show desperation and tolerance and a progression of the addiction. Okay. How a drug is administered influences the onset of the effects, the peak effects, and the duration of the effects. Okay. Right. First we have oral. That would be swallowing a pill. And if you think of an ibuprofen or something like that, it can take 15 to 20, maybe even 30 minutes to start to work. That's okay if you have a headache, but if you cut your finger off while slicing vegetables, that's not going to do it for you. And so hopefully you'd be on your way to the emergency room where they would give you something that works a little bit faster. Okay. So we swallow tablets and liquids. They're usually less expensive, and sometimes they can be removed by stomach pumping or dilution. Okay. Things like ibuprofen and narcotics, actually, opiates can cause stomach or intestinal distress. They can be abrasive. Okay, right. Injecting, there's several different ways that a person injects. Intramuscular injection is akin to the flu shot. It's a very slow mode of ingestion because it's in the muscle. So an example of that would be the birth control injection or the flu shot, where you don't need it to work very quickly. We have subcutaneous injection, which is skin popping, which is your tuberculosis injection. Or sometimes they give you fluids this way as well, and we do that in veterinary medicine. So a person would pinch the skin and form a little bubble and then put the needle under that, and then you'll get a bump on the skin, and then the medication disseminates over a period of time. And that is usually how the tuberculosis test is given. And then we have intravenous injection, which is one of the fastest ways of getting a substance. The drug enters the bloodstream directly. A lot of people don't like this because it's painful. It's very difficult, but not impossible, to remove, dilute it, or neutralize. And that's why the risk of overdose is so great here. And because it goes directly into the bloodstream, unlike some of the other routes of administration, the problem here is that we are bypassing all of the body's defenses. Okay, so if you smoke something, the cilia in the nose will filter everything like it's supposed to. If you swallow something, it's a long journey from the mouth all the way down to the stomach. And there's a lot of things that the body does to protect itself. Okay, so we are effectively rendering the body's defense systems. Yeah, okay. we have inhaling, which is very rapid. Um, we have snorting and smoking, okay, and huffing would be insufflation. It's very rapid. It's estimated that smoking is actually faster than intravenous. Intravenous is maybe about 10 to 15 seconds. Smoking is about 5 to 7 seconds before you feel the effects. Okay. Right. For a person that has been using or snorting, there might be soft palate damage and damage to the nose, mouth, trachea, and lungs. Now, other routes of administration would include topical, so in through the skin, such as a cream. LSD is absorbable through the skin. Okay. Now, we also have vaginal absorption. An example of this might be a spermicide. And every once in a while you will hear about people, usually teenage girls, soaking tampons in vodka or alcohol. And that is incredibly dangerous because the blood vessels are so thin there and everything is exposed and very sensitive. And doing something like that can cause toxic shock syndrome. And another route of administration that has medical purposes, but usually not when we get to the stages of addiction, would be anal absorption. An example of that would be a suppository. But same thing, if we were to put alcohol or something else in the anal cavity, we're at risk for, could potentially be fatal. There's something called booty bumping, which is usually reserved for raves, where somebody would take an ecstasy tablet, wrap it in a little bit of tissue, and insert it into the anal cavity for absorption. Okay. So all of these have medical uses. But also we can see the progression of the addiction. So for example, perhaps a person starts off, they have a back injury and they're taking Percocet orally as directed. And then they learn that they can crush it and snort it. Vicodin has a lot of filler in it, and it's, from what I've been told, very painful to snort. So a lot of people don't do that. Percocet is a little bit less than that. But a lot of people find that snorting is painful. And so then people might progress to smoking. So we go from oral, where the absorption might be 15 to 30 minutes, and then we go from intranasal, 10 to 15 seconds about, maybe a little bit less, and then we go from smoking 5 to 7 seconds. Okay. And then perhaps the person decides to switch to heroin because pills are very expensive and heroin is not expensive. And then they start off by smoking heroin, and then they go to injecting heroin intravenously. And there are instances where people have been using intravenously for so long that the blood vessels, and the veins rather, collapse, and then they do use intramuscularly. Okay. So those are some examples for you. So when we take a detailed drug history, it's very important to note any change in the route of administration, okay, especially when we're looking at long-term users. Okay. It's important for us to look at drug interactions. Okay. And additive interaction is when the various drugs combine to increase the intensity, number, and duration of the separate drug effects. Okay. For example, alcohol and marijuana are sometimes used in conjunction with another drug to enhance the effects of the second substance. A synergistic interaction, those are unexpected drug interactions. Okay. Knowledge of the separate drug effects doesn't accurately predict the resulted combined effects. Okay. So for example, combining alcohol with a depressant could really result in central nervous system depression, including coma and death, rather than relaxation or sleep. But it's really unpredictable, and we see that combination a lot with celebrities, Whitney Houston, Heath Ledger, etc. Okay. In antagonistic interactions, the drugs counter one's effects. Okay. So for example, in pharmacology, combining morphine and naltrexone. Naltrexone has greater affinity binding power than morphine, but doesn't affect the efficacy, the stimulatory power. Okay, so then the naltrexone occupies the receptor sites and blocks the morphine and doesn't produce effects on its own. Okay. A speedball, which would be having heroin and methamphetamine in the same syringe, would be the same thing. Okay. Speedball is cocaine and heroin, and a goofball would be methamphetamine and heroin. Okay. All right. So on top of all this, we then have to look at the physiological functioning of the drug user. Pharmacokinetics are concerned with the physiological processes involved in the body's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And then we have pharmacodynamics, which is concerned with the study of where and how a drug produces its effects. And a lot of that is based off of how the substance is being used. So unless a substance is directly injected into the site of action, a substance must travel from the site of administration. Okay. So the distribution of a substance is very systemic. So it's distributed throughout the body as it travels within the blood, much like as if a person has food. And then the drug must have an affinity for some element or move by hydraulic pressure. And then the speed at which a drug is distributed depends on the efficiency of the heart. And then whether the drug reaches the site of action depends on both the dose, because it will be diluted through the body, unless, of course, going right into the bloodstream, and then the affinity of the drug for various biological compounds. Okay. Is it stored inactive or in non-responsive parts of the body? Okay. So there's a lot to it. And then we have, of course, metabolism. The liver, a healthy liver, is capable of chemically altering the original substance to form a new and often inactive drug. One of the disadvantages of swallow drugs is that significant proportions of them are transported from the digestive system to the liver and metabolized before having any effect on the user's behavior. Okay. Right. Now, metabolism can be affected by a lot of things. It can be affected by thyroid. It can be affected by disease. It can be affected by malnutrition and cardiovascular functioning as well. So this is your dimension 2 of ASAM, where we are looking at the health of a person. Okay, so if a person has cirrhosis of the liver and they're drinking, and there is a rare form of cirrhosis that is non-alcohol induced. So it's very important here in Dimension 2 to get a complete history as well. Okay. And then, of course, we have excretion. Okay. And the main organ for that, of course, would be the kidneys. Okay. So we could have damage to the kidneys because of drug use as well. So if the body is unable to filter and eliminate because of prolonged substance use, then the body could shut down and the person could potentially die. Okay. All right. On page 44 of your text, there is an overview of the effects of the parasympathetic and sympathetic control. Some of you might not have had this biology since 7th or 8th grade, so there's some great charts here and also some resources in Moodle for you as well. Basic cellular biology. Okay. More importantly, on pages 46 and 47, we go and look at the neurotransmitters and what substances act on what neurotransmitters in the body. Okay. We have acetylcholine, which is probably the most widely distributed neurotransmitter. It's found in the several different nervous systems. It's involved in voluntary behavior, sleep, arousal, food, water intake, learning, memory, and mood. And you're going to see the chart on page 47, which shows which drug affects which neurotransmitter and then how that manifests itself into action. Okay. I'm going to try to pronounce these. Catecholamines are a group of neurotransmitters with similar chemical composition, dopamine, for example. is involved in motor activity, reward, and enforcement. And we have adrenaline, epinephrine, and noradrenaline, norepinephrine, which are in autonomic neural activity. Serotonin is involved in all mood, aggressive behavior, appetite, and sleep arousal. And then we have GABA, which is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain and modulates sedation and sleep. And then endorphins, which are naturally occurring morphine-like compounds. Okay. Right. How do drugs affect neurotransmission? They can destroy neurons. It could be toxic, and it could interrupt the neurotransmission pathways. They can alter the neuron membranes. Enzymes definitely have an effect here as well. They can be synthesized. They can release neurotransmitters. It can destroy neurotransmitters and have an uptake inhibition. They can mimic neurotransmitters. They can have both receptor affinity and efficacy, and they can produce false neurotransmitters, blocking the receptors and change in receptor sensitivity. So it's important to note that not all substances affect all species. For example, there is a honeybee in the Himalayan mountains, and the honeybee does not have the chemical composition in its brain to recognize hallucinogens. So one of the reasons why drugs act in humans is that our neurotransmitters are very similar. So for example, in our brains we have endocannabinoids. Cannabinoids, of course, should remind you of cannabis, and so that's why humans are able to have that high. Honeybees do not have the ability to feel LSD type effects. And so there is this very rare type of honey in the Himalayas that is psychoactive. It's very much like acid or LSD. And so honeybees don't trip out on this because they can't. They don't have the biology for it. So there's been cases where humans actually fall to their death trying to get this psychedelic honey, because humans, of course, can experience the effects of psychedelics. Okay. All right. So it doesn't affect them. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So the body is always going towards a state of homeostasis, basic physiological functioning. So the body's always trying to get back to baseline. Drug-induced changes in neural transmission can stimulate homeostatic changes in other neurological processes. Okay. Then we have rebound and withdrawal. If a person has been taking a substance for a period of time, they can go into withdrawal because the body has then become used and accustomed to having it. Okay. Repeated use of the drug, the compensatory processes in response to the absence of the drug can require more time and be more difficult to achieve physiologically. Okay. Right. Other factors here, the age of the user could be very important. There is a theory that addiction follows the same pathways as learning, and so that a person using from an earlier age, there might be different implications than a person that starts using later in life. Gender, there are physiological differences between genders, hormonal differences, okay, and physiological functioning. Weight, so my example earlier of a rhinoceros getting a tranquilizer versus a human getting tranquilizer there. So if a person weighs more, they're probably going to need more of the substance to feel the effect. Race. A user's race may directly and indirectly influence the effects of a drug. Okay. There can be variations in blood chemistry and other physiological characteristics. And then nutrition as well, very important. Is the person using on an empty stomach? Do they have a pattern of malnutrition? All right. And then maybe talked about a little bit less, we have food and drug interactions. Various food and nutrients may interact with drugs to alter the effects of those as well. So for example, the presence of food in the stomach delays the onset of swallowed drugs by interfering with absorption. Right. Disease and damage can also affect if a person has been using, let's say, alcohol for a long period of time and the liver has started to break down, we might have something called a reverse tolerance, which is where the liver and the organs of excretion are so bogged down and diseased that it only takes a little bit of alcohol for the person to feel the effects. Okay, great. Genetic factors. It's estimated that biological predisposition and genetic factors can play about 50% a role in addiction. And they found this by looking at twin studies and examining the differences between identical twins and fraternal twins. So, fraternal twins, of course, meaning that there's 2 eggs and 2 sperm, and then identical twins meaning that the egg splits. Okay? So, if a fraternal twin has an addiction, it was about a 50-50% chance that the other twin would also experience a similar plight. In identical twins, however, almost 9 times out of 10, because it's the same from the same egg and the same sperm, if an identical twin had an addiction, then the other twin most likely had an addiction as well. Okay. All right. Okay. So, when we're doing a drug history, we need to look at the intention behind using the drug and if that changed or not, because then we can see the progression of the addiction. Okay. And so we're looking at previous drug experience, okay? Expectation. So you might have heard of a bad trip. If a person is intending to have a substance and they think that it's going to be great, then it might be. If they are in a negative mood that day or there's something bad happens, then the substance could potentially increase or heighten that emotion as well. Set in mood. Okay. Right. And the circumstances around the drug use, it'd be very different if somebody is forced to use a substance, which happens, versus somebody's 5 years old and they see liquid on the counter, they think it's apple juice and it's actually beer, and that might be the person's first use. Okay. All right. The physical environment, social environment are also very important in terms of the experience. And going back to intention. So in general, a person's more likely to use a substance if they have a positive experience with it. And going back to the bad trip, a lot of people that use hallucinogens, and if their first time is not fantastic, they might not use again. So looking at, okay, I like the taste of alcohol and I use it to relax, versus I can't get on with my day unless I use alcohol, or it's the first thing that I go to, and the intention changes. Another example would be having legitimate pain and taking a prescription, and then the pain is gone, but then the use continues for psychological reasons or emotional reasons. Right. So on pages 54 and 55, all the way over to page 59, we have some comprehensive drug charts that I'd like you to take a look at. And they are classified there. So we have stimulants, depressants, opiates, inhalants, cannabinoids, hallucinogens, phencyclidine, stimulants, depressants, and you're going to look at what systems these drugs act on, the common effects of the drugs, etc. If intoxication, overdose, and withdrawal are possible for those. Okay. It's also important to note that sometimes alcohol and other drugs are classified in their own classification. Nicotine is often also classified in its own classification as well. As again, going back, dosage makes a difference. In some aspects, nicotine could be a stimulant, in others it could be a depressant. And then we have hallucinogens, which are sometimes referred to as the all-arounders. Okay. So when we get to dimension 5, when we are looking at the ASAM assessment, we're going to come back to this and you're going to see how the questions are very specific. And tell me about the first time that you tried cocaine. Okay. Where were you? Who were you with? What were you doing? How was the experience overall? And then tracking each drug and seeing if things have changed or not. Okay. All right. So this is it for chapter 2. If you do have questions about specific substances, please go back to your 400 textbook and check those out. Okay. Again, the purpose of this chapter is really to give us more of an overview of all of the background information and things that affect a person's using experience. Really?